Cov. Hey, I wanted to take a minute and just celebrate and thank you all who came yesterday for our Christmas tables. We had a great time. I made a little trip from just down the street at Can-Am Pizza to Central America, to Africa, to Nepal, and back. A culinary journey, and it was delightful. So thank you all for participating. If you didn't make it this year, well, you're just going to have to wait till next year. But it was a lot of fun, and thank you for celebrating who we are together and who we hope to be in the future. And we're so excited about that. And I think everybody had a good time. Yeah? That was there? Yeah. So with that, let us look at our text for this morning. We've already read our verses for this morning from Isaiah 11, but I want to read just a few of them again. Verses, we're just going to read the first 5, which read like this: A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space, where heaven and earth meet. Amen. So as we have been talking about and hearing about this morning, we are in the season of Advent. And the season of Advent is a season of, to use a fancy academic term, a season of liminality. Advent is liminal space, that is, space that is in between, which is to say that something is coming, and we know something is coming, or we hope something is coming, but it is not here yet. But what was before isn't working anymore. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Does that sound like life? About 10, 15 years ago, I was doing some work for some school that I was doing, and this idea of liminality was in a number of articles that I read, and I became kind of enamored with this idea and what it meant, and just thought a lot about the beauty that is there. Now, the reality is different than the concept, because about 4 or 5 years after that, I found myself in liminal space, in space in between, where one thing had ended, but nothing else had yet started. And I can tell you that the academic or kind of mental concept of liminality, while appealing and beautiful and somehow, just this great idea, in practice, in actuality, when it's really your life, not so great, not so fun. We find ourselves waiting and wondering if anything is going to happen at all. Brian Zond writes this about Advent. He says that during Advent, we await the arrival of the Messiah of whom the Hebrew prophets spoke. During Advent, we allow the messianic poems of the Hebrew prophets to seep deeply into our soul. With Isaiah and the great company of Hebrew prophets, we wait for the one who will bruise the serpent's head. We wait for Emmanuel, the one who is God with us. So this first or second Sunday of Advent, we hear again from Isaiah, as we will all the way through this Christmas season. We're going to stick with the prophet Isaiah. But the prophet Isaiah gives this image in chapter 11, where he says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit." It's an interesting idea, this idea of a stump and a shoot coming out of a stump. Why this image? And then if we really think about it, why the stump of Jesse? Jesse was never king. Jesse was the father of a king, David, but Jesse himself was not king. And so why the stump of Jesse? Why not the stump of David? That, after all, is the one that all of the prophets point back to, that this Messiah who is to come will be the new David, that he will restore that empire and that dynasty that David established, right? So why the stump of Jesse? Well, I think it has to do with exactly that. Jesse was not a king, and yet David came from Jesse. Jesse was not a king, and yet God elevated one of his sons, as if you read the story, the least of his sons, to become king over Israel. God raised a king from Jesse, even though he was not a king. It seems that Isaiah is saying that God will again raise a king from nothing. You see, it had been over 600 years since David's reign. The stump of Jesse was well and truly dead. There was no royal lineage continuing on. It had started well, depending on how you look at it. David does pretty good. He's described as a man after God's own heart. There are some issues there, right, with certain behaviors. Then he has Solomon. Solomon is the wisest of all the kings, and yet not so wise when it comes to partnerships, shall we say? And then from there on, it's just a downward slide into just dysfunction and ultimately the demise of the nation. And Isaiah comes to this people. Remember who he's speaking to. He's speaking to the people of Israel who are in exile. They are without hope. They don't know if or when they will ever get to go back to Jerusalem. And so Isaiah gives them this image. Out of the stump of Jesse will come a shoot. In other words, God is going to do something new and unexpected, and out of that death, out of that dead stump, will come the hope of all people. So then Isaiah goes on to describe this Messiah in verses 3 through 9. He gives a whole list of qualities and characteristics that this Messiah will have. And in fact, if you count them, there are 7, which should not escape our attention. Right? There are 7 qualities that Isaiah lists that the Messiah will have. And notice that when Isaiah gives this hope, he doesn't just say to these people who are aching for God's deliverance that one day God will restore to them a nation. No, he goes beyond that to say that this Messiah will announce the coming of God's rule, not just over their land, but over the whole earth. That this Messiah will come and will institute something that is so far beyond just Israel, just their nation. That he will announce justice and righteousness and all of these things. So what are these qualities? Well, some of the qualities are that the first one is that the Spirit will rest on him. And the language that's used here when it talks about the Spirit resting on this Messiah, the idea is that the Spirit will rest on and equip and give that Messiah everything that he needs to do what God is calling him to do. That Spirit is not just visiting, it's indwelling and empowering the Messiah. It's a spirit of wisdom and understanding, counsel and might, knowledge and fear of the Lord. And then verse 3 says that he will delight in the fear of the Lord. Now, that's always a bit of a problematic phrase for us, because we hear fear of the Lord and we think abject fear oftentimes, like cowering. And certainly this word in Hebrew can mean that, but it also means awe or reverence, and that's the sense that's given here. The fear of the Lord, awe and reverence, worship of God. And so this is who the Messiah will be. And then in verses 3 to 5, it talks about how with righteousness he will judge for the poor. Now, the word that is used here that's translated righteousness, again, this is one of those places where English sometimes isn't the best language for describing what's happening, right? I mean, it's the language we have, right? But remember, the words that we're reading were not written in English, right? And so the Hebrew is a much richer language. There are meanings and kind of colors that go to words that in English maybe don't quite translate. Righteousness is one of those words. The word that's translated righteousness here it especially refers to the need for social justice to be done to the poor, the needy, and the oppressed. And unfortunately, Israel's leaders had quite often failed in this regard. In fact, there's a reason why Israel finds itself in exile at this point, right? It's because they had forsaken God's ways. Their leaders had forsaken doing what God had told them they should do, which was to administer with justice, right? To take care of the poor and the widow and the oppressed, to not favor the rich. And this is one of those places where the more you dive into this, the more you can't help but recognize echoes of our own culture in the biblical text, where we see these issues and the injustice that happens in the world around us, and we long for that righteousness that Isaiah is talking about. But one of the things that's really important for us as we think about what this means is that this is not righteousness that is achieved by our morality or the effort that we put into it. Because oftentimes when we hear that word, righteousness, we think right living. We think morality. We think correct behavior. And it's much deeper and richer than that. It certainly contains that element, but that is not the summation of the entire word. This righteousness that the Messiah will have does not come by his own effort. It comes by who he is. It comes from those qualities and characteristics that we read in the verses immediately preceding this. It comes from the fact that the Spirit of the Lord is resting on him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and of might, of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. That is where this righteousness comes from. And so when we hear that this Messiah is going to exercise judgment, then oftentimes we move from that morality, where that kind of shorthand where we were, and we move to that judgment is bad, right? That it's painful, that we should avoid it. And yet the poor in this passage, and the poor in general, when the Bible talks about how the Messiah will come and exercise judgment, for them this is a relief. This is God's coming to rescue them, not to condemn them, but to announce judgment on the systems and the problems that have put them exactly where they are, and that one day he will remove and restore and make all things right. And so instead of hearing judgment as a negative thing, in this sense, judgment is deliverance. Now, that's also true for us when we think about our relationship to God. Because oftentimes we get stuck in how we relate to God because we think that we have that negative connotation of judgment. But another way to think about judgment is to think of just that judgment is simply God telling the truth about where we are. If we can take a little bit of a step back from kind of the browbeating and the guilt and all of the things that make judgment negative for us, which isn't to say that some of that isn't healthy. There is a certain amount of guilt that is healthy, right? We should feel bad about when we hurt people, when we hurt God, when we do those things. But overwhelmingly, judgment is deliverance. It's simply God telling the truth about where we are. And so when Jesus comes, when the Messiah comes and announces judgment, we look at it not as condemnation completely, but as release, as redemption, as restoration, right? And so when the Messiah comes, he announces judgment, but in that judgment is our deliverance. And just as the people of Israel, as Isaiah is announcing these words of hope to them and telling them that, yep, the stump looks dead and it's been dead for 600 years, and yet a shoot will come out of that stump. God can bring life out of that. And then he goes on in verses 6 through 9 to describe what that life will look like. And it's such powerful poetry. Right? Imagine this. This is poetry that was written literally over 1,000 years ago, and we still hear it read in public over and over again. Name one other poet. I mean, there aren't very many, right? That we're still thousands of years later reading that poetry, and it is even in a completely different language. It strikes us in such a powerful way. Because we hear in this description the world that we so desperately want to believe that God is bringing. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. I don't know about you, but I want that to be my neighborhood. And all of this lays out what it is that the work of the kingdom is doing, what it is that the Messiah, when he comes, will institute. Right? That this is a description of the ultimate kingdom of God. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I believe that these words have fascinating implications for our work as an outpost of the kingdom here in Kent and wider King County. We exist, brothers and sisters, as a foretaste of that kingdom, the now and the not yet. And it has implications too as we hear that description. We hear this idea of how we care for all of creation, nature and humans, both mattering deeply to God. What might it look like to step more deeply into that call. But I want to go back to the stump. I want to return to this image of a shoot coming out of the stump. The verses that follow describe how this root of Jesse will gather his people and what the world will look like when that Messiah comes in fullness. And I want you to remember again that this word that Isaiah announced was given first to a people who were in exile, a people who had been stripped of the land, a people who had been stripped of their place in the world, a people who were wondering where God was and whether or not he was actually for them anymore. And we recognize that we wait too. We also exist in a time where we have experienced the coming of the Messiah. We believe that in the coming of Christ, that this work was begun and the kingdom is at hand, and yet we also recognize that it is not yet. It has not come in fullness. We find ourselves in the now and the not yet. Brothers and sisters, I want you to understand something this morning, is that we are playing a long game in the middle of a speed-obsessed world. We're playing a long game in the middle of a speed-obsessed world. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the game that we're playing, the work that we're doing, the kingdom that we are a part of is an ultimate thing. It is a thing that follows the arc of human history. It's not something that we're going to solve in 3 weeks with a program or 3 years with a plan or whatever it might be. We're obsessed with that idea, right? Well, if we just do this, this, and this, click, 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 we're going to boom, everything will be great. Because that's America. That's how we do it. We come up with a plan, we execute the plan, and then we reap the rewards. That's not the game we're playing. We're playing the game that describes a place where the lion eats grass like an ox. That doesn't happen in a day, or a week, or a year, or a decade, or even a century. It's a long game. We're patient. We wait. As a church community, we are in the midst of waiting to see what God will do in this next season. And yes, we do the work of seeking and listening and thinking about where it is and what it is specifically that God is calling us to do in this next season, but we recognize that this is all part of that long game. This is not something that will be done in our lifetimes. This is work that our children will take up. God's kingdom will continue to move forward. And so we get comfortable with recognizing that we do what we can, and we wait to see what God will do in our midst. Brothers and sisters, perhaps you find yourself this morning feeling like that stump, cut off, seemingly dead. Or maybe you're pretty sure it is dead. And yet, God is not finished with your story. How might Christ be born in you this season? How might Christ be born in the midst or out of the stump of your life? How might Christ be born out of the stump of your relationships? How might Christ be born out of the stump of your career? How might Christ be born out of the stump of wherever it is that you feel dead in your life? Because I believe that part of what the season of Advent does in us is to help us wake up to the hope that out of the stump of Jesse will come a shoot. And just as God has done that before, He can do that in our own lives as well. You know, one of the things I love about the way that we worship and the way that we remember is that the Eucharist, the table, is a rehearsal of exactly what we're talking about. It's a rehearsal of God's kingdom. We come and we rehearse the feast of the Lamb that we have experienced and that Jesus instituted in the Eucharist, the breaking of His body and the shedding of His blood, and it looks forward to and rehearses what we will experience at the great wedding feast of the Lamb, that great feast when all things have been set right and we join together in the kingdom, in fullness, with the bridegroom, and we experience the fullness that Christ has promised. And so with that, we come this morning to the table.